little something extra for the waiter who always gets your order right and makes your dining experience unforgettable. Have you ever felt paying extra was a burden on your side? Does it seem like a discriminating practice that may create a culture of entitlement among service workers? Tipping was often considered a generous practice given out of love and appreciation for your assistance from the servitor. Tipping is an important part of American service culture and is accounted as a means to express appreciation for a good service. But why tipping in America is up for debate now. In today's video, let's explore why tipping is becoming a weird practice and where did Americans go wrong. The origin of tipping. Though it is merely a myth, the word tip is said to be an acronym for to ensure promptitude. Basically, the tip was given as a reward or gratitude in return for pleasant and timely service provided by a person. Tipping may date back to the Roman era, but most sources trace it back to medieval Europe when wealthy visitors to homes would leave tips for servants who provided good service. The practice of tipping as a straightforward money exchange originated in London taverns and coffee houses during the Tudor era to ensure quick and good service. It is widely believed that tipping resulted from the caste system that ruled Europe back in the late Middle Ages. Essentially, the division of classes in society played a pivotal role in each possible beginning of tipping practices. Altogether, the practice started as providing small incentives to people working under rich people. In 1916, William John quoted, "Tipping and the aristocratic idea it exemplifies is what we left Europe to escape. It is cancer in the breast of democracy." The history of tipping in America is almost parallel to American history, quite unlit and dreadful. In reality, tipping was something that wealthy Americans discovered when traveling to Europe. According to sources, tipping in America began in 1840. Being able to pay extra for service showcased their status and wealth, which many of their egos could not resist. Evolution of tipping in America. In America, the advancement of tipping was skeptical from the beginning itself. It gave rise to unfair double standards, discrimination, and social divides. It also paved the way for restaurants to pay their employees less, with the expectation of tipping and picking up the rest. William Scott called tipping un-American and flunkyism that borders on bribery and amounts to legalized robbery. He also wrote, "Someday, somehow, it will be uprooted like African slavery." Unfortunately, that prediction proved wrong, and tipping became deep-seated in American society. Tipping, which originated in Europe and was largely a European practice, was fully spread among Americans, and obviously, it was taken to an entirely different level. Americans seem to both adore and abhor the custom of tipping. The practice of adding 20% to an American bill seemed antipathy, but it was difficult to remove. Tipping became established in America following the American Civil War, and soon after, the 13th Amendment was passed, abolishing slavery in the USA. Most enslaved people who were set free primarily employed in the service and hospitality sector and then often relied on tips to supplement their little to no hourly pay. The recent abolition was not strong enough to uproot the racist approach of patrons towards the workers, and it was greatly reflected in their tips, sometimes leaving them unpaid. Thus, service industries turned out to be another dungeon of enslaved people with jobs, who were forced to live at the mercy of tips for income. Over time, the public started acknowledging tipping as a moral issue rather than a means of flaunting their opulence. It began to haunt their minds that if you didn't tip, you were unintentionally substantiating slavery. As an effort to minimize the tipping burden, multiple states in the USA initiated anti-tipping laws to abolish tipping. The Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 devised the federal minimum wage and the 40-hour workweek, and banned child labor. Even though it was one of the last major strategies for combating slavery, the federal government did not include tip workers as part of the new minimum wage law. In 1942, the Supreme Court favorably ruled that employees kept all their tips. This law successfully put an end to the sharing of tips with the kitchen staff, which employees entertained at the time. In 1966, Congress created the tip credit. Restaurants were supposed to pay workers a sub-minimum wage as long as their tips exceeded the minimum wage threshold. They set the tip credit as a percentage of the minimum wage between 40 and 60%. The same year, Congress paralyzed the sub-minimum wage for tip workers at $2.13 per hour. The crucial fact is that tip restaurant workers with the minimum wage are at least twice more likely to live in insolvency than the general US population. As mentioned by the US Department of Labor, the restaurant industry is the lowest paying employer in the United States. Tipping becomes a crisis. Regardless of all these rules, regulations, movements, and resistance, tipping is still integral to the dining out experience. Paradoxically, Europe, from where America adopted the custom of tipping, has annihilated it much before. A standard service charge of 15% is applied to all bills in countries like France, Denmark, and much of Europe. Such a system cannot be called ideal, but at least it avoids the embarrassment when we are compelled to choose the tip percentage while the cashier waits for us. Preferably, the price of service must be included in the product itself, as in Japan, China, and South Korea. Perhaps it would be more appreciable if tipping were banned and considered rude and disrespectful. Interestingly, in many countries, people consider tipping equal to degrading the employee and the employer as well. The rationale is simply that if you're tipping, you're fundamentally hinting that the employer is underpaying the worker. Unfortunately, this tendency is ubiquitous in America. It is critical to notice that the demographics of service industries have drastically changed. The service providers are no longer the old bunch of enslaved people. Ironically, white people constitute over 50% of all waiters. Thus, tipping has moved away from the racist end, although it still creates a classist culture. But it doesn't imply that the public is in favor of the tipping system. These days, the service industries are filled with a bunch of high school students and young adults. For these people, doing service work is often part-time, so they are much more inclined to the tipping culture and are often willing to gamble. Instead of taking a set minimum wage, they're willing to bet on the generosity of people. The digital dilemma. With digital advancements, tipping has become more prevalent, and it's easier to tip than ever. Technology has escalated the number and frequency of tips. People can provide tips at their comfort by clicking on the options on the tip screen during the billing process. Digital ordering technology has also prompted tipping in recent times. Though it is a boon for the serving class, the customers who are already frustrated with the system bite the bullet. Technology has applied the science behind the psychology of tipping and strategizes how to maximize tips. The dark reality is that digital payments have transformed the expense culture much easier and much more luxurious. The infamous iPad payment terminals turned out to be the whistleblower of the game. These terminals employed a high-end technique, suggesting a minimum tip of 18%. The customer is free to skip the tip and manually type in if they disagree with the set standards. But in all these cases, there is room for awkwardness, and customers get the guilt of avoiding or manipulating the tip, which leads to more frustrations. The traditional custom of leaving tips on the table for the servers to acknowledge the amount after the customer leaves was much more satisfactory. In such cases, the customers can be honest enough and pay the server according to their capability. The worst part of modern tipping methods is that while we are compelled to select the tip amount, the cashier is waiting over it, and everyone behind us will notice and judge us according to the tip we offer. So with the help of technology, the service industries have nailed down how to brilliantly exploit peer pressure to maximize tips. As the world gets smarter with digital payments, the legacy of slavery is brought back in the form of resentment among customers. It is unfair to force customers to tip service workers who are paid well. It will be appreciable if a conversion of giving them a thank you note is encouraged. Theoretically, if the service workers are paid better wages, we can eliminate the tipping culture in America. On the contrary, eliminating tips will simply give businesses more opportunity to gauge prices. The only way to counter this predicament is for customers to become more sensible about tipping. We have to be conscious about how much we spend on the product or service and the point of giving a tip to a particular individual. If it really makes sense, there is nothing to be annoyed about, and if it doesn't seem logical, we are free enough to deny it. Are you team give tip or team deny tip? Comment down below. Also, drop a like if you think that tipping is outdated. And of course, consider checking out our channel to suggest future video ideas and continue subscribing to see more social dilemmas logically answered.